Hey guys, so today we're going to start on the introduction to the patriarchal history. So Genesis 12, Abraham's story. So let's begin with this. And I'm glad to have y'all back. I'm glad to be back doing this. So here we go. Introduction to patriarchal history. So Genesis 1 through 11 gave us visionary material, right? So we had the three falls of man, Adam and Eve's fall, which brought death and mortality, and Cain's fall and the flood, sinfulness with the demons, and we had the Tower of Babel, the ziggurat, which was the dividing of nations. So last time, Genesis 1 through 11, we were talking about that was visionary material, but it was also history. Well, the same thing still happens and applies here with Genesis 12 through 50. So this is patriarchal history, and it's presented as visionary material and history. So it's given to Moses on Mount Sinai. So before chapter 1 through 11, we got the primordial history with a lot of symbolism, and we couldn't get timelines much, but this was deliberately done this way. And Genesis 1 through 11 told us one set of stories definitively to make a point. So now Genesis 12 through 50 will primarily focus on a new set of stories and histories that involve God and 4 generations of a family. So note that this is still visionary material, but here God is giving Moses the patriarchal history, which will set us up for the Exodus, since Genesis is essentially a prologue. So it is visionary material because we get what's relevant, but we also are going to find that it is historical, but we will skip through lots of history in it. We'll skip a lot of things. So, for example, nothing is told about Egypt's foundations, right? We're just told that it's established at some point. And if one doesn't like the structure of Genesis, you can blame Ezra, the scribe, and editor. And for this particular study, we're going to argue, and we're going to say that we're not going to argue. We're just going to say that for simplicity's sake, this is 2000 BC that we're starting in. So Abraham is in Ur, which is already an ancient city of Sumer, one of the earliest civilizations of mankind. So this is in the Mesopotamian area. And so Sumer and Akkad were the two main regions here. Sumer and Akkad, by 2000 BC, were having a Sumerian renaissance, and they built the great ziggurat of Ur, which was dedicated to Nana, a moon deity, which was completed probably sometime in Abram's lifetime. So we're going to go with 2000 BC, but I'm going to say this because if I didn't, I wouldn't be telling you the truth. Some scholars do go as far back as 4000 BC, while others do it around 1500 BC. So for simplicity, I'm going to say that it's around 2000 BC in this study. And the truth is, unless something changes, we can't really know definitively, and we should be honest about that. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to say 2000 BC roughly. So, we're just going to use that for now. And if you've got some arguments for a better date or whatever, give them to me. I'd like to hear them. Like I absolutely would. So there are lots of Jewish traditions that also connect Abraham to this time period. So you have the Ur 3 period, which I'm going to give you this. It's funny for historians because in history, there is no Ur 2 period. There's only Ur 1, Ur 3. You'll have to look up why that's the case. But anyways, God will come to Abraham. He's not Abraham yet, but he'll come to Abraham and he'll tell him to leave this all behind. So each city, like Ur, had a divine king, and Abraham would have been called out of Ur. So until cities start to come together more, there's not a clear pantheon yet, entirely like we'll get later with Greco-Roman. But polytheism does exist in this time, obviously, and the material, spiritual, astrology stuff is all connected in the pagan world too. So we're going to be talking somewhat about that as we go. But the patriarchal history of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, introduces us to the lives and faith journeys of the founding fathers of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. These chapters chronicle God's covenant promises and their unfolding through a chosen family despite human flaws and challenges. Beginning with Abraham's call in Genesis 12, we see God's promise to make him a great nation, bless him, and make him a blessing to all the families of the earth. So the covenant serves as the backbone of the biblical narrative. It shapes the identity of Israel, later the church, because they're the same thing, and the path that leads to Jesus as the Christ and points us to God's ultimate plan of redemption. So while the patriarch narratives are telling us historical accounts, it's also visionary material that reveals God's unfolding plan for humanity. So through visions, dreams, divine encounters, these stories provide glimpses of a future shaped by God's promises. Abraham's vision of descendants as numerous as the stars, Jacob's dream of the ladder reaching heaven, Joseph's prophetic dreams about his family's future demonstrate God's active guidance and the forward-looking nature of his covenant relationship. So as the story progresses, we're going to encounter the next generations, each with their own unique struggles and triumphs. So Isaac, the child of promise, teaches us about God's faithfulness in fulfilling his word. Jacob, through his wrestling with God and transformation into Israel, exemplifies spiritual growth and reliance on divine grace. Joseph's remarkable story of betrayal, suffering, and eventual leadership in Egypt will highlight God's sovereignty and ability to bring good from evil. So together, these narratives illustrate God's unwavering faithfulness, the importance of trust and obedience, and his ongoing plan to redeem and restore his creation through a covenant relationship. And these also will remind us that God's promises are not confined to the past, but remain dynamic and visionary, pointing us to a future shaped by his divine purposes. So, and I'm going to continue with this. So, interwoven into this historical narrative of Abraham, are also theological and symbolic narratives. So this is why it's visionary material here from Genesis 12 through 50. So that means that there's going to be more of a theological emphasis on stuff. So the stories are trying to highlight God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants, emphasizing God's divine promises, faithfulness to God, along with moral lessons, rather than just giving us historical facts to the intended audience. So sometimes the narrative in these chapters will serve as archetypes for us to follow. So, for example, Abraham's journey to becoming a prototype for a sainthood, we'll see he becomes our prototype. So you'll see all of his trials, his tribulations, some of his mistakes, and all of it's going to reflect important spiritual truths that we can employ as we embark on our own journey in life trying to follow God, right? So make no mistake, though, that these events did happen historically, but what we get is given to us as a vision from Moses. So the primary purpose is revelation, not documentation, which invites the reader or listener, as originally Genesis was orally given to everyone. So they used to just by the campfire, or just they would be telling you this, right? They didn't have it all just written down at first. They eventually did, but they used to share it orally. So, anyways, the purpose is revelation. So it's to focus us on the spiritual and moral messages within the text. So just as we got like these large and sometimes symbolic lifespans of the patriarchs in Genesis 1 through 11, like Adam and Noah, like they had really long lifespans, right? We also might be getting this with the lifespans of Abraham. So why is this? So in this time, it was common for ancient people to assign symbolic lifespans to their legendary ancestors. So we find this actually Sumerian kings did this. So for example, the Sumerian kings list, if you go look at it, it'll include these rulers with big, gigantic lifespans that are like thousands of years, right? And then but they were based on historical figures. So maybe Abraham did make it to 175. Maybe he did. And if he did, I stand fully corrected. However, Abraham's lifespan in Genesis does seem to fit neatly with this tradition that you find in the ancient Near East, where they would do this to mark one as a divinely chosen patriarch rather than just another historical person. So it's not saying that they weren't real. They are historically there. They were historical people. But the main goal is of Genesis a theological one. So that means its primary goal is to tell you and me and the reader, it's to communicate God's covenant and his faithfulness and the role of Israel's ancestors, rather than providing just some exact biographical details. And you even notice this too with the Genesis, because it does this literary thing called telescoping. So sometimes you're just not getting like, you won't get like, it'll skip years. It'll do stuff like that where you're like, okay, that's interesting. It doesn't share his whole life. It just shares like the really important parts, and that's called telescoping. Um, and that's what's going on here, and that's done so that we have an emphasis on Abraham's relationship with God, his family, and his faithfulness to God, along with his role as being the father of many nations, not on how many literal years he lived or his exact full life biography, right? So this doesn't actually conflict with the idea that Abraham was a real person. So being this is visionary material, Genesis allows us to have these historical figures be presented to us in a way that helps communicate and aid us in getting the deeper spiritual meanings of the text and the Holy Spirit and what the Holy Spirit is trying to give us. So, anyways, that is going to be the first lesson tonight or today. And that is the introduction to the patriarchal history. Next up, we will do Genesis 12 and we'll start it. So, thank you for listening, and I hope you got something out of it. And if you like what you're listening to, hit like and subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.